As you can probably tell from the qualifications, my background is not in religion, but in professional services. I'm a chartered accountant. What am I going to talk about? Just a little bit about me. I want to set the scene. I'm often come across people talking about Islam, a religion of peace, with a big, loud question mark at the end of it. I want to distinguish between religions and the people who practice them, because they are two different things. And then I'm going to talk quite a lot about Islam, and I've got a bibliography for you, and then open it for questions and answers. My preference, unless it's a really utterly desperate question, is if you can leave all the questions until the end. It just makes it much easier. I'm planning to talk for about an hour, and that gives us almost an hour for questions and answers afterwards. So this is me. I've lived in Manchester since I was 2 years old. My entire career, apart from 1 year as a teacher in a secondary school, was spent in professional services, and almost all of that giving tax advice. I'm an expert on tax. But I've been interested in religion all my life, and some of the things that I do now, I'm the co-chair of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester, and I've done over 30 religious broadcasts on BBC Radio Manchester in their 90-second Thought for the Week slot. I'm very active in politics. I chair a Muslim grouping inside the Conservative Party, and I'm involved also with things like the Free Faiths Forum. Key thing in retirement, I developed this my website. It's got over 500 pages and a lot about religion. And this talk will eventually end up on the website as well. So, a religion of peace? Question mark. Because I'm used to that being thrown back at Muslims these days. Because Muslims often talk about Islam as a religion of peace. Interestingly enough, I never do. If you search on my website for that phrase, Islam, a religion of peace, I don't think I've ever used it. I've got a hadith. I'm going to talk about hadith in more detail later on, but I've just picked this one in particular because it's extremely famous. Talking about Muslims fighting and killing Jews at the end of time. And the reason I picked this particular hadith is that Hamas have included it in their charter of 1988. The Hamas charter is often accused of being an anti-Semitic document. I think that is probably fair. And this hadith is right there in it, converting what is a territorial dispute over land in Israel and Palestine into a religious dispute as well. I said before, it's important to distinguish between religions which are abstract systems of thought and belief from the people who practice those religions. It's often very hard to do intellectually, but there is a clear distinction in my mind. And I want to have a very quick look at the history of all three of the Abrahamic religions. Judaism, there was a Jewish kingdom in both what is now northern Israel, destroyed by the Assyrians. The capital was in Samaria. Samaria is the region. That capital was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The southern kingdom survived quite long later, but was destroyed by the Babylonians, reconstructed, then conquered by the Romans. But after the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the Romans basically, well, the Jews revolted twice, once in 70 AD, once in 132, and they destroyed the temple completely. Jews were prohibited from being in Jerusalem. For 2,000 years, Judaism was an exile religion, which is how everybody puts it. Everybody skips over two Jewish kingdoms that did exist in the Yemen, Himyar, and the Khazars, but since the rest of history tends to ignore them, we're going to ignore them as well. So Judaism is very much a religion of a minority, people living in other people's countries, although in Israel now, of course, we have a Jewish majority state and growing religious influence inside Israel, particularly as the ultra-Orthodox community grows in population. Christianity, a persecuted minority religion in the Roman Empire until the Emperor Constantine got Christianity. this vision of seeing the cross in the sky, and this sign you will conquer. From Constantine onwards, Christianity was associated with the state and with rulership, both in the Western and Eastern Roman empires, and of course even after Rome was sacked by the Goths, the Eastern Roman Empire continued until the fall of Byzantium in about 1400 and something AD. But Christianity throughout Europe was always associated with kings, with rule. And the European Enlightenment is very much a case of people trying to liberate themselves from a state controlling religion. That's why the Pilgrim Fathers went over to what is now the United States of America. And today, in most places, though not all, the state enforcement of Christianity is quite low. Russia, interestingly enough, seems to be going in a backward direction with the growing influence of the Orthodox Church. And then Islam. Islam, again, was a persecuted minority religion, but we're talking for a very short period of time. And then, when the Prophet moved to Medina from Mecca, because his life was in danger and also because the people of Medina wanted him to come, it was a society where it was ruled by a Muslim, namely the Prophet, although we'll talk about Medina in detail towards the end of the presentation. And from that time onwards, particularly with the Arabs, there were very rapid Arab conquests leading to an Arab empire. There were other Muslim empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire, which ruled most of the Middle East. And in India, with the Mughals, after the Mughal emperors conquered most of northern India. They were ruling a Hindu majority, but rulership was with Muslims. Again, in historical terms, people forget that Muslims were still a minority in large parts of the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, there was never any conquest. Indonesia and Malaysia didn't become Muslim because anybody conquered them, but simply through force of missionary activity, persuasion, etc. And that's how Islam is spreading southwards in Africa. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, inside Islam, there's been this fundamental struggle between what I call secularization and increased religiosity. We're seeing that right now in the Middle East. The pace of the establishment of the Arab Empire was absolutely breathtaking. That was achieved in about 100 plus years from the lifetime of the Prophet. And it was ruled by Muslims continuously until the rise of European colonialism in the 19th century. That brings me back to this extract from the Hamas Charter, because Muslims are often accused of genocidal tendencies. People look at this, they look at the Hadith, and they say Muslims wanted to exterminate Jews and Christians. Well, they had over 1,000 years to do it, and they made a really bad job of it. Because after the rise of Middle Eastern anti-Semitism associated with the establishment of the State of Israel, these are some numbers for Jewish refugees from Muslim-majority countries who moved mostly to Israel, some to the USA and Europe, in the middle of the 20th century. Morocco, 250,000. Iraq, over 100,000. If Muslims had been trying to exterminate Jews in the Middle East in 1,000 years, they made a very bad job of it. The reality, of course, is they had no such goals. Similarly with Christians, vast numbers of Christians in the Middle East. Sadly, with the pressures that we're now seeing, for example, there were 1 million Christians in Iraq at the time of the 2003 Second Gulf War. They have suffered through association with the American and British invaders, but organically, Christians were a very established part of Iraqi society until then. Again, there simply never was a Muslim goal of eliminating Christians from the Middle East. And it's very hard, as I said, to separate religions from their practitioners, but ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, religions are about theology. It's about what do you believe about the nature of God, about the nature of man, the purpose of life. And that's what I want to look at. So moving on to a closer look at Islam. I see people reading ahead. This is always a danger of handing out hard copy slides, and what I actually never do it.
Well, I'm hoping they might be able to make some notes on it.
Right. Yeah. So, authority in Islam, first of all. I regularly suffer from something which I refer to as Pope envy. And the way that it arises is that every time there's some terrorist incident, and of course most Muslims will say that was something that should not have been done, it's a criminal act, etc., you get various anti-Muslim bigots. And to name somebody who I think I can name without fear of a libel lawsuit, because she has been banned from entry to the UK because the government considers her presence in the UK would not be conducive to the public good. That is a lady called Pamela Geller in the USA, who runs a very anti-Muslim blog site. The attitude that she has, and other people like Robert Spencer, who is similarly banned from the UK, is that the authentic, real Muslims are the terrorists and the extremists, that they are practicing real, authentic Islam, and that people like me and the other Muslims you'll meet who condemn terrorism are actually weak, lukewarm, not quite Muslim, liberal Muslims, moderate Muslims, or not really Muslims at all. And it's very difficult to rebut that within Sunni Islam. If somebody said, if a Catholic goes out and murders a lot of people and then says he's doing it in the spirit of authentic Roman Catholicism, it's easy. The media would get in touch with the Vatican, the Pope would say, nope, that guy's got it all wrong, this is what Roman Catholicism says, and the media would accept that as the authentic position of Roman Catholics. There is no equivalent mechanism for most of Islam. There is for parts of it. I don't know of any Ismaili Muslim terrorists, but if there were any who claimed that they were authentic Ismaili Muslims, the Aga Khan, who was the head of the Ismaili Muslims, would instantly squelch that. Same with Ahmadiyya Muslims. But in Sunni Islam, there really is no religious authority. Occasionally, people throw back at me the question of Grand Muftis, which several countries have, for example, Egypt. A Grand Mufti is simply a state-appointed person. He's appointed by the authority of the state to run mosques, religious schools, etc. in that country. But as far as I'm concerned, he derives no authentic authority from within Islam. It's simply authority that's been given to him by the power of the state to run institutions that the state has chosen to control. So coming on to what I believe about Islam, and while I can only talk about what I believe, one thing I am crystal clear about is that mine is not a one-person minority. There are vast numbers of Muslims who believe exactly what I believe, even if they wouldn't put it in the same words that I tend to use. I spent 65 years of my life speaking English, and I've lived in a very multi-religious society. Muhammad Amin, MBE. The reason for the MBE is not to re-emphasize the point, but it helps to make my name unique, because otherwise Muhammad Amin is an incredibly common name. Muhammad is the world's most common given name. So that's me. Person number 2, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Who can tell me who he is? Not you. You're not allowed to answer any questions. Any offers? Yeah?
He's related to one of the Hadiths, but he's also took up the name in ISIS.
That's the man I'm thinking of. This person, it's a pseudonym, but this person is the leader of ISIS. Occasionally you hear news stories that the Americans have managed to kill him, but as far as I'm aware, that's not been authenticated. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and I are both Muslims. Many people, by the way, would consider that statement controversial because, unfortunately, very many Muslims try arguing that these terrorists are not really Muslims. I flatly disagree with people who hold that view. If a person prays regularly, fasts, reads the Quran, doesn't eat non-halal food, wants to go on pilgrimage, does all the things that any other Muslim would want to do, they're a Muslim. Even if they believe in killing other people, even if they believe in capturing people and taking them as slaves, that does not stop them being a Muslim. It just makes them a very bad person. So we, the two of us, hold wildly divergent views on Islam. That does not mean that all views on Islam are equally valid. That, by the way, is an argument which is occasionally put forward, that any text, because it can be read in so many different ways, all readings are equally valid. My view, as somebody who spent his entire working career reading texts, namely tax law, is that any text has better interpretations and worse interpretations, and interpretations that are so off the wall they couldn't possibly be right. And we'll be looking at some of the texts later on, but in my view, what Baghdadi believes, not his mainstream Islam bits, but what he believes in as a leader of ISIS, is simply a serious misreading of what the texts are actually telling us. The theology of Islam is the simplest theology that I know, although not really that much different from Jewish theology, which is also incredibly simple. God created you. He lets you choose how you want to live. You have freedom of action and thought in a way that animals don't. He tells you how you should live, and then he will judge you after it's all over. Incredibly simple theology. I spend a lot of my time talking to Christians and Jews and other Muslims, and all three religions, of course, spent enormous amounts of time interacting with each other. Islam and Christianity normally on the opposite side of the Mediterranean, basically having periodical wars with each other, interspersed with long periods of intertrading. Jews living as minorities in both Christian countries and Muslim-controlled countries, and almost always having a far better time in Muslim-controlled countries than Christian-controlled countries. But the thing which I find depressing is the lack of serious knowledge of the other religions amongst the practitioners of each of these religions. When Christians look at Judaism and Islam, their goal is normally to look at the text and to explain why the others are wrong. And the same is true for Muslims looking at the other religions, and the same is true for Jews. And I think people who do that are shortchanging themselves quite seriously. And I think what you need to do is to really look at each of these religions as they are. It doesn't mean you have to believe them, but you have to try to really get underneath the skin of what believers in those other religions actually believe. And I describe that as reading the texts with sympathy. It's not a phrase I invented. I picked that up from Jonathan Brown's book on Hadith. The concept that once a text is regarded as a canonical text, then it is read with sympathy, trying to find out what's positive about it rather than simply reading it to try to criticize it. And I've got a question for you. I read the whole of the Bible from cover to cover in my early 20s. And when I read the Old Testament, I was really struck by the fact that somebody has been incredibly seriously misrepresented in the Old Testament. Any offers? No offers? Yeah? God. Absolutely. You got it even without the clue, because I was going to give you a clue if you got really stuck. In the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament in British Christian society is incredibly slandered, in my view. Because the impression you get, especially if you watch Monty Python, is that God spends all his time doing nothing but waiting for a chance to smite people. That's it. And not the sort of character you would want to have anything to do with. When you read the Bible, when you read the Old Testament, you really understand, when you read books like Isaiah, for example, how much God was distraught by the perpetual misbehavior of his chosen people. And you can only get that if you are willing to pick up the text and read it, put any preconceptions you have to one side, and just read what the text actually says. And I would encourage you to do that with every religion you ever engage with, whether it's one of the Abrahamic religions or Buddhism or Hinduism. Just read what the text actually says. So let's have a look at the sources of Islam. And I know you may have covered some of this already, but there's nothing more dangerous from a speaker's perspective than assuming that the audience knows what the speaker has in mind. And I think it's much safer to at least cover it briefly. As far as Muslims are concerned, it's very simple. The Quran is the word of God, received in a very direct way by Muhammad and recorded very shortly afterwards. Revealed in small parts over a period of 22 years. Other people learned it, they memorized it, and it was written down, and a canonical version was produced under Caliph Uthman, and the text has been stable ever since. That is the overwhelming, well, that's the universal view amongst Muslims. It's also the overwhelming view amongst non-Muslims, except of course that non-Muslims believe that Muhammad made it up using Jewish and Christian sources. There is a radical counter view developed by a scholar in London called John Wansborough in the 1970s, that the Quran was created much later, about 100 years later, and not in Arabia but in Iraq. And I'm not going to talk about that, but if you're interested, there's on my website is a book review of Wansborough's book Quranic Studies. And Tom Holland touches on some of the same issues in his book In the Shadow of the Sword, which is also reviewed on my website. So the Quran is God's word. When you're reading the Quran, if there's something you can't understand, the solution to understanding that is to read the rest of the Quran, because the text has to be read and understood as a whole. And then you have to ask yourself, what did God want you to do? What did he want you to do when it was revealed? And my view, what does he want you to do now? Because those two are not necessarily the same thing. That is regarded as quite a controversial statement by some Muslims. There's a school of interpretation, Quranic literalism is the best way to put it, which believes that you simply look at the plain words, that words have that straightforward plain meaning, and that meaning is frozen for all time. I have a maths degree, and in mathematics, if you want to disprove a proposition that claims to be universally true, you only need one counterexample. That's it. If you have one counterexample to a proposition that claims to be universally true, you have destroyed it. You don't need more counterexamples. So I have one for you. A counterexample to this proposition that Islam is completely unchangeable. The Caliph Umar, the second caliph, so not some wild radical, but somebody who lived with and knew Muhammad personally for years and years and years, deviated from what Muhammad used to do and deviated from the plain text of the Quran when he was in charge as caliph. And the issue is about something called Zakat, which is, yeah?
Sorry, I was just going to ask if, I don't know if I've misunderstood, but I don't think, if I understand the Quran to be the words of...
The word of God, yep.
Then it's not necessarily about the changeability of Islam, but the changeability of the word of Allah.
Nope, the word of Allah is frozen in time. The text of the Quran is the text of the Quran. The question is, what do you do with it?
Why would you change what you did with it?
Well, let me give you another example, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. There are inheritance rules in the Quran. Fixed inheritance allowances for sons, daughters. Sons get twice as much as daughters. Mothers, fathers, uncles, etc. have certain allowances. As far as I'm concerned, those rules were devised for the society in which the Quran was revealed, when economic opportunities for women were drastically different from economic opportunities for men. I believe those rules made sense then. That was the society they were given to. The text will be in the Quran for all time, because the text of the Quran ain't ever going to change. I do not believe that those rules are applicable today. My will does not reflect those rules. Yep?
Do you put yourself in, as an interpreter, do you not put yourself in a position above the Quran?
Well, let's take Caliph Umar. Let's take Caliph Umar, because you can think I'm a radical. Muhammad Amin spent his entire life living in the UK. He's got too westernized. Caliph Umar, you cannot say anything like that about. Caliph Umar was a companion of the Prophet. He was chosen by the Muslims to be their leader, and let's look at what he did. Zakat distribution. Zakat is a compulsory charity in Islam that you have to give. It was given into the central treasury, and in the Quran, in verse 960, it categorizes those people who are entitled to be given money from the state treasury that's gone into the state treasury as zakat. These are the categories of people: the poor, the needy, just what you'd expect. People who administer the collection and distribution of zakat, and those whose hearts are to be won over. Now, what does those whose hearts are to be won over mean? Well, we know what it means because the Prophet Muhammad himself used to distribute zakat to his former enemies in Mecca who'd come over to Islam, who'd been reconciled by coming over to Islam, even if they were rich, because he wanted them on side. That's what the Prophet used to do. So it's quite clear what the Prophet thought Quran 960 meant. Umar decided that circumstances had changed while he was caliph, that there was no more danger of these Meccans revolting anymore, and he stopped giving them zakat. In doing so, he was deviating from what the Prophet used to do, and he was deviating from the plain text of the Quran because he excluded them completely from any more participation in zakat distributions. As I said, you need only one counterexample to the proposition that Islam is a fixed set of rules that never changes. Yep.
Can I answer the question? So, I appreciate that if you're separating Islam from the Quran, but I still think I'd suggest that I said potentially in interpreting something away as contextual, you place yourself authority-wise above the Quran. I'd suggest that, what was the name of it?
Caliph Umar.
I would suggest he's done the exact same thing. And is he then an enemy of the Quran? And if that's the word of Allah, and he is interpreting that away, does he place himself alongside Muhammad as someone who's bringing fresh revelation?
You will not find a Muslim in the world who thinks that Caliph Umar was out of order when he did that. Not one.
Okay. Does that make it right?
That's the end of that one.
Okay.
So the next source of Islam, apart from the Quran, are what are called Hadith. And Hadith are actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which were obviously observed by other people who were around him and passed on by word of mouth until they came into the hands of Hadith collectors who wrote them down as the collections of Hadith. Now, the background to this is that during his lifetime, the Prophet discouraged people writing down what he was saying. The reason was that he did not want them to confuse what were his words from the words of God, received via Gabriel and passed on obviously by Muhammad. When Muhammad was passing on the word of God, he clearly wanted that recording, writing down, memorizing, and he did not want people to confuse his own words with the words of God. So he discouraged writing down his own sayings. So these hadith were collected long after he died. And the scholars who collected these hadith, they emphasize the chain of transmission. I'm a hadith collector. I heard it from A, who heard it from B, who heard it from C, who heard it from D, who got it from his father, and that's what the Prophet said. And they tested these chains of transmission. So if two people in the chain could never have met because one died before the other was born, you know that's a busted chain. Somebody's made it up, but it couldn't possibly be true. If they lived remotely from each other and could never have met, even if they lived at the same time, that's a busted isnad, chain of transmission. Or if C in this chain was a notorious liar. And Muslims accumulated massive biographical dictionaries. One of the big drivers for doing biographical dictionaries was to understand these hadith transmitters. And all Muslim scholars recognize that the hadith in the hadith collections are of varying degrees of reliability depending upon the strength of the chain, the identity of the people, whether there are lots of parallel chains or a single chain. Unfortunately, what I call the laity, which is a slight misnomer because, of course, in Islam we don't have a priesthood, but the ordinary common garden Muslims are often taught when they're quite young, going through Islamic education, that if a hadith is in the major hadith collections like Bukhari and Muslim, you can bank on it. It's like gospel. And the most extreme version I had that was somebody who is a Muslim, who's a member of the House of Lords, who said to me that to disbelieve the accuracy of a single hadith in Bukhari is an act of disbelief that puts you outside Islam. The guy was bonkers. He'd never attended any sort of proper hadith training school at a Muslim university where they would have disabused him. And if you look at the 6 major hadith collections, and I've listed them more or less in order of significance in the way that Muslims regard them, where Bukhari and then Muslim are regarded as the top 2, and the others not quite as good but still very, very sort of high quality collections. These hadith collectors died well over 200 years after the date when the Prophet moved from Mecca to Medina. A long time in between. When you're looking at hadith, the first thing you have to do is decide how good do you think this hadith is. Is it reliable? And all the scholars have tended to put their effort into testing the chain of transmission, although they've all, to some extent, looked at the text of the hadith, because sometimes the actual text of the hadith itself can tell you this hadith couldn't be reliable. Once you've established that it's reliable enough to take seriously, then the question you have to ask yourself is, what were the circumstances? What did the Prophet intend at the time that he said it? Why did he say it? And then from that you have to work out what guidance you draw from the text today. Again, with hadith, as with the Quran as far as I'm concerned, you cannot simply say, because the Prophet did something then, that's what you should do now. There's a famous scholar called Shafi, we will look at later on, who gave religious rulings when he was in Iraq, and then he moved. He moved to live in Egypt, in Cairo, and he gave slightly different religious rulings, because the circumstances in Egypt were different than the circumstances in Iraq. And I'm quite clear that if the Prophet were alive today, some of the decisions that he took, that he would be faced with, were decisions that simply didn't exist in those days. You don't have a view on stem cell research in 600 AD, because stem cell research does not exist. If you're alive today, you have to have a religious view on a question like that. And similarly, I've no doubt that some of the decisions he took at the time, he would take different decisions now. And scholars are not really an Islamic source, but I put them together because many people behave as if they were. There have been many, many learned scholars in Muslim history. And there are 4 main surviving schools of Sunni thought, and these are the scholars that they come from. On most things these schools agree, but on many things they don't. And you will find some Muslims who take the approach that if you're a Sunni Muslim, you have to belong to one of these schools. In other words, you take all your guidance and rulings from that school, ignoring what the other schools say. That is not my approach to life. And as far as I'm concerned, the opinions of all of these scholars are interesting. You shouldn't ignore them. You should actually look at what they said and why they said it. But then it's your life. You have to decide what you're going to do. Because one day you will answer to God yourself. A very important and quite controversial subject in Islam is abrogation. And this is particularly important because people like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, they go for abrogation in spades. I've got 2 slides about drinking. The first one has two quotes about alcohol. So the top one, there's great evil as well as some benefit. Second one, don't pray while you're drunk, which implies that you can drink when you're not praying. You know, otherwise it wouldn't exist like that. The third one, drink is the work of the devil. Could belong in the temperance society. Three quite different positions on alcohol. And of course the Quran was revealed over a period of time. And this verse from the Quran does make it clear, in my view, that as in the case of alcohol, God is willing to change his rulings in that period of 20 odd years when he was revealing the Quran to Muhammad. Because the community itself was changing. They started off, the community as a whole, knowing very little about religion and were learning about it as they went along. But the question is, how much abrogation actually occurs in the Quran? Was it a lot or a little? And you get drastically different views. My view, by the way, is very little. Equally controversial, in fact even more controversial, can the Quran be abrogated by Hadith? In other words, if you can find something that Muhammad said which disagrees with the Quran, do you follow the text of the Quran or do you follow the Hadith which Muhammad is supposed to have said? And the majority view amongst Muslim scholars is that a really high quality Hadith can abrogate the Quran. But he also points out that two of the four founders of these Sunni schools disagreed. My own personal view is that the Quran is from God. Nobody can abrogate it. That isn't the same as looking at something and deciding that circumstances have changed, you live your life differently from what the plain text of the Quran says, because circumstances have changed. But you can't actually simply rewrite the Quran. And a hadith, if a hadith appears to contradict the Quran, it's far more likely that the hadith itself simply isn't genuine, no matter how reliable, apparently, the chain of transmission. And in one of the books in the bibliography about redefining the criteria for assessing hadith, you'll see the list when you get to the biography pages. That book has a whole chapter discussing a number of hadith in Bukhari, and in fact there's a whole section in Bukhari about predestination. And the point about predestination is that it fundamentally contradicts the whole theological basis of Islam, which is that God gives you free choice. Because if God is going to judge you, he can only judge you and condemn you for something which you've chosen to do. If you're a puppet and he's pulling the strings, you're no more than a marionette, then how can it be morally right to judge you? So my view, and the view of the author of that book on hadith, is that those hadith which talk about predestination are simply not reliable. Religious uniformity. We've seen in the Middle East with ISIS, basically them going around saying to people, either you convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. And one of the most fundamental messages of the Quran is that God could compel everybody to believe, but he chooses not to do so. And that there's no single exclusive pathway to God. This is a verse from the Quran. If God wanted to, everybody in the world would be a practicing Muslim. He has only to snap his finger to make it so if he wanted to. This is one of my favorite verses from the Quran, 2.62. Sabaeans are a people who are now sort of vanished, but they lived in that part of the world at that time. as well as Muslims, and Muslims are the people who believe in this divine writ, Jews and Christians, if they do righteous deeds, if they believe in God and if they believe in the Day of Judgment, they don't need to be afraid of what's coming on the Day of Judgment. Surprisingly, there are many Muslims who want to basically find a way of ignoring that verse. Some of them will argue that it's been abrogated, that other developments subsequently mean that it is simply no longer applicable, even though it's there in the text of the Quran, while others mistranslate it. I'm not an expert on Arabic, but I was given a copy of this Sahih International Translation of the Quran a couple of years ago after I spoke at a seminar. We all got a goodie bag, all 6 of us, and in the goodie bag, chocolates, etc., and this Quran translation. And I turned to it, and I was utterly shocked by the way it was translated, because you can see it's been put into the past tense. And I then went and checked lots of high-quality Quran translations, and none of them put it into the past tense. This is very much a deliberately distorted translation of the Quran. But it's given away free at metro stations in London, etc. There's an enormous industry funded from Saudi Arabia pumping out hatred, basically. There's an article about it in more detail on my website. Again, from the Quran, a 2-page extract of the quote. It is God who causes groups of people to have different ways of worshipping him. And if these people argue with you, that's Muhammad, just say to them, God knows what you're doing. And anybody who carries on doing evil, they will answer to God on the Day of Judgment. Another key point, which I've touched on before, when I said that you answer to God alone on the Day of Judgment. This phrase, no bearer of burdens shall be made to bear another's burden, occurs again and again in different verses of the Quran. And another way that it tends to put is, no soul shall bear the burden of another soul. You are responsible for what you do right and what you do wrong. You are not responsible for what other people do right and other people do wrong. It is not your responsibility to save them from committing sin. That is their problem. This is addressed to the Prophet himself. The Prophet's mission was to tell people what God's message was, and then it was up to them to absorb that message or to not absorb it. His role was simply to warn them, not to compel them to be good. Apostasy, a very controversial subject amongst some Muslims. God is quite categorical, first of all, that abandoning Islam is a serious sin. And if you die having abandoned Islam, you should worry about what's going to happen on the Day of Judgment. If you abandon Islam, as well as what happens to you on the Day of Judgment, your life in this world may not go too well. I mean, most of us want God to be on our side in how we're living our regular lives. We want it to rain in the right times and not rain at the wrong times. But the Quran is completely silent on punishment for apostasy by other people. There is absolutely no earthly penalty for apostasy prescribed in the Quran. People sometimes argue that 5.33 is an earthly penalty for apostasy, but it isn't. When you read it properly, it's a penalty for making war on God. And all kinds of different things can happen to them, one of which is actually just being banished. but it's a penalty for rebellion against God, insurrection, treason basically, rather than a penalty for simply deciding that you don't believe anymore. Hadith, there are penalties. There are hadith which claim that the Prophet regularly punished people for apostasy. Here's one of them, here's another one, and you could find more. But Kamali, in his book Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, points out that those hadith, there's a standard of reliability required of hadith before you can make legal rulings on them, from them, before you can jail people, execute them. And these hadith simply don't meet that standard of reliability. And my view is even more strong. Not only do I regard these hadith as weak, I regard them as utterly unreliable, because the Prophet would not have gone against what the Quran teaches. If God chooses not to punish people for apostasy in this world, I can hardly see the Prophet doing it. And one of the most subtle aspects of belief, as far as I'm concerned, is the role of what I've described as historical contingency. Now, of course, from a religious person's perspective, it's arguable as to whether contingency exists. A quote from the Bible here, and a similar quote from the Quran. But to the extent that we do have free will, then things that have happened in time, in theory, could have been different. And go back to Islam, the Prophet was a real human being taking decisions. And what decisions would he have taken if the circumstances had been different? For example, in Medina, he set up a state. There was no Muslim state when he was in Mecca, when the Muslims were a minority. And one of the interesting questions from my perspective is, what would have happened if the Meccans had never tried oppressing the Muslims, but simply carried on sort of not believing them? Many of the decisions taken by the early Muslim rulers were practical, operational decisions. They created new taxes that are not in the Quran. They created new laws additional to the laws that you derive from Sharia. One of the fascinating lectures I attended by this chap Jonathan Brown, who's mentioned in the bibliography, a couple of years ago, he came to SOAS to speak. He's an American, white American ethnicity who converted to Islam a while ago, and he's a professor of, I think it's Georgetown University. And he goes for very provocative lecture titles and book titles. And the title of this lecture was, "Is there justice outside God's law?" And the point he was making in this lecture is that apart from Islamic law in its traditional sense, which is derived from scholars from the Quran and Hadith and a superstructure built on that sort of foundation, aside from that, Muslim states have always had another system of law, which is simply decisions made by the ruler, the Ottoman Sultan, for example, to establish laws simply because he considered them necessary. And these, of course, are what he describes as being outside God's law. And he gave an example of a particular town where there was so much criminality which couldn't be dealt with satisfactorily applying the rules of traditional Islamic law, that even the Islamic scholars came to the local governor saying, "Can you sort this out using the caliph's sort of, or the sultan's rules?" And people who tell you that there is absolutely no distinction between church and state in Islam are just incredibly oversimplifying. I want to touch briefly on something called, the name Salafi Jihadism is a phrase that was made by, or created by a chap called Shiraz Maher for his book on Salafi Jihadism. But it's basically the ideology behind Al-Qaeda, behind ISIS, and these other terrorists. And let me start with a verse about fighting. I've deliberately only printed a little bit of the verse because you often find it very decontextualized, both in the hands of Muslim extremists and also in the hands of people like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, anti-Muslim bigots. They like to throw, this bit of verse at Muslims in a very decontextualized way. I'm not going to spend time now looking at the full context, but when you read the full context of the part of the Quran that this verse is in, and you understand the historical circumstances of the time, which was that there was a treaty between the Prophet in Medina and the pagans in Mecca, a truce basically. The verse was revealed in the context of that treaty, and it is far less bloodthirsty when you read it in context than if you decontextualize it. There has always been extremism in Islam. The Kharijites were a very extreme group, and basically no Muslim was ever good enough for them. They assassinated the fourth Caliph Ali, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet. He was the Prophet's first cousin, and they assassinated him because they felt he wasn't a good enough Muslim. That's the kind of extremism that you got then. That's the kind of extremism you're seeing right now in the Middle East with ISIS. And what I've called modern Islamic revivalism. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in 1928, at a time when Egypt was basically a sort of shadow colony of the British. It was nominally independent, but the British ambassador basically ran the place by pulling the strings with the allegedly sort of independent Egyptian government. The Jamaat-e-Islam was founded in British India in 1941 at the time of the Raj. And Hizb ut-Tahrir, founded in Jerusalem in 1953, that's 5 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, a sort of a response to the Palestinian disaster. And in practice, external factors like colonialism have been a big driver in the growth of Islamic extremism. They have various tools. We're not going to spend hours going through the detailed beliefs of Islamic extremists, but they have some fundamental concepts that they recycle regularly. One of them is takfir. Takfir is the act of classifying another Muslim as a non-Muslim. You argue that that person has done something that causes them to go outside Islam. And that can be as little as listening to a radio station. When ISIS hang people or cut their heads off for listening to Western radio stations, or for shaving their beards, or for not wearing hijab or niqab, before they can kill them, they are effectively having to classify them as non-Muslims. Because the one thing that even ISIS believe is that killing another Muslim is a major sin. But they solve that problem quite easily. Whoever they want to kill, they first classify as the non-Muslim. It's easy. Jahiliyyah, Muslims talk about the pagan society of Mecca before the time of the Prophet as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. And that phrase has been recycled, particularly by an Egyptian thinker called Sayyid Qutb, to describe not so much Western, British or American societies, but actually to describe the societies of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, etc., with their real live human rulers, like Nasser. So Nasser was the dictator of Egypt at the time. In fact, it was Nasser who eventually ordered Sayyid Qutb to be hanged. And Sayyid Qutb's view was that the Muslim states that existed in the Middle East, they were all in a state of ignorance, just like the pre-Islamic Arabs, which is why it was okay to revolt against them. And jihad, which has always been understood, well, jihad is a word which means struggle, and it has two fundamental meanings. One of them is your own personal inner struggle to be a better human being, and the second one was collective self-defense by the Muslims. So when the pagans of Mecca were trying to conquer Medina, the collective self-defense that the people of Medina engaged in was jihad. But Islamic extremists have this concept now of individual jihad, where they argue that it's the duty of each individual Muslim acting by himself to wage jihad on behalf of Islam, which is a totally ahistorical way of interpreting jihad, totally contrary to all of the traditional schools of Islamic law, etc. Now I said earlier, and the three examples I gave, Palestine, Egypt, the British Raj, were all colonialism. It'd be nice to be able to blame all extremism on colonialism, but unfortunately you can't. And the example I've got here, that area shaded in sort of dark red, is part of central Arabia known as the Najd. It's basically all desert. And it was never colonized by Europeans, ever. It wasn't even taken over by the Ottoman Turks. They had the western bit, they had Iraq, they didn't bother with the desert. They weren't interested. It is from that desert that a man called Muhammad Abdul ibn Wahhab came. As an Islamic revivalist, he was horrified by the practices of the Muslims he saw around him. He managed to persuade the Saud family at that time to agree with him, and they started to enforce his views in Arabia, and also they used to have raiding parties into Iraq where they would go and kill Shias, because as far as Muhammad Abdul ibn Wahhab was concerned, Shias were not Muslims. They had deviated from Islam so much that they were now non-Muslims and therefore they could be killed. And that ideology is still there. It's being spread now with the full weight of the Saudi state behind it. That's what pays for tens of millions of copies of that Sahih International Translation of the Quran to be given away free all around the world. Antidotes to religious extremism: learn more history. The world is not a simple case of Muslims good, non-Muslims bad. There has been good and bad on all sides. Learning more about the religion. The more you understand how differently religious texts have been interpreted over time, the range and diversity of religious views amongst Muslims, the less likely you are to be a Muslim extremist. And when it comes to enforcing God's laws on other people, the question to ask yourself is, does God really need your help? Now, that's all I want to cover in detail. And I have got some extra slides which I've inserted for you, mainly because the Constitution of Medina was the world's first written constitution. And it's right there in the oldest biography that's available in writing of the Prophet Muhammad. And so even the most extreme Muslim extremists like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi cannot argue that this constitution isn't genuine. They may try disputing its interpretation. And it shows how when the Prophet was in charge of Medina, he was running an inclusive society. And we're just going to skip over the slides very quickly, but you've got them at leisure for reading. So Medina wasn't just Muslims, it was Muslims and the other people who were allied to them in Medina. And they were to be one community, one ummah. Compare that with today, where particularly Muslim extremists go on and on about the ummah, talking about only Muslims as a way of separating Muslims from their non-Muslim fellow citizens. All of Medina was one community. Muslims, Jews, pagans together, because there were pagans in Medina at that time as well. There were various tribes involved. There were obligations given to the Muslims to not leave anybody poor, avoid sin. Protection was given to Jews as well. And the unity and the peace of all of the people of Medina applied to everybody. Murder was prohibited, don't help evil people, war, the costs of war were to be shared between Muslims and Jews and others. Everybody had freedom of religion, and that applied not just to the Jews, but to allies of the Jews. Fighting was authorized. You were not allowed to go out and fight except with the permission of Muhammad. You know, the total opposite of individual jihad, as ISIS talk about today. Shared costs, consultation, and Medina was a sanctuary for everybody under this agreement, with the Prophet in charge as arbitrator. and don't help the enemy. The enemy were the inhabitants of Mecca, who were perpetually trying to conquer them. Mutual support, Jews and Muslims, and even non-allied Jews had some status. And as I said, the source is from the very first biography of Muhammad. I promise you a bibliography. If you've never read the Quran, the translation you should read first is number 1. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's about 500 pages. The great advantage, it has 2 great advantages. It's in very modern English. The translation was done in 2006 or thereabouts. And it has very few footnotes. So you can just read it without having to spend time reading endless footnotes. If you're interested in research, I strongly recommend The Message of the Quran, first of all, because it's available free on the internet. You can get a PDF of the whole document for free. Muhammad Asad himself was a fascinating person. He was born as Leopold Weiss, from memory, Polish Jew, born in the year 1900, converted to Islam at the age of 26, and had a fascinating career. He met everybody, Chaim Weizmann, Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia. He eventually became Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations for a short period of time, and he's buried in Granada in Spain. The Study Quran is a brand new translation, came out a couple of years ago. The mixed team of Sunni and Shia translators. The translators also come from both backgrounds of being born into Islam and people who've converted into Islam. And it's extremely well researched, well documented. And abrogation is such an important subject, I recommend this book on abrogation. Hadith, I mentioned before, book number 1 is the standard textbook in English on Hadith. The second one is the one that talks about redefining the criteria, paying more emphasis on the text of the Hadith. Jonathan Brown's book is fascinating, about how Bukhari and Muslim, those Hadith collections, came to have the status that they have amongst Muslims today. Because they didn't start off that way. When they were first created, they were controversial. People said, how dare Bukhari publish a collection of a Hadith that he claims are all authentic? And if you want to read Hadith for yourselves, you can find the lot, basically, at this website at the University of Southern California. For Islam, generally, that's a really good biography of Muhammad, very traditional. Martin Lings was a white British convert to Islam. Hans Kung is a Roman Catholic theologian. So you can't argue that he's biased in favour of Muslims when he writes this. It's a 700-page book, but it's very easy to read. Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, about how you develop Islamic law. Michael Mamiza's book is the source for what I was saying earlier about Caliph Umar. It's quite a nice short book on Islamic law. The next one, number 5, is a 20-pager. You can download the PDF free from my website. It's about what the Quran actually says about war. And Shiraz Maher's book, Salafi Jihadism, you have to buy, but if you want to become an expert on the ideology of terrorism, that's the book to go to. So that's it. Over to you.